I'm going to turn it over to Meg Lindsay. She is Innovia Foundation's Director of Education. She has tremendous background and experience in the areas of workforce development and skills attainment. With no further ado, Meg Lindsay with Innovia Foundation.
Thank you, Aaron. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's workshop. I call it the Wednesday workshop. It's awesome. So today we just have the pleasure of getting the next hour together, spending that time talking about how we can build resilient communities with the lens of skill development and workforce development. A passion of mine, as Aaron said. I'm super passionate about this topic, and it's just a pleasure to be able to connect this group and this opportunity to our keynote today, who is Julian Thompson. And so as we think about today, and before I really get into introducing Julian, I want to pose a question for you all to think about for the day. So as we think about this workshop, keep in mind this question: how are we engaging excluded populations as we are building skill development and workforce programs? So keep that in mind. Julian Thompson, who is the strategist for the United Negro College Fund and the Institute of Capacity Building, is going to take us through the next hour and highlight some work that he is doing in his home base of Atlanta, Georgia. And he also did this work in Cleveland, Ohio as well, or Columbus, Ohio, excuse me. So he is cultivating strategies and programs that improve resiliency and sustainability for excluded populations, historically Black colleges and universities and the broader Black community. He's going to take that information, he's going to talk about system building and how you accomplish that, and then he's going to bring it down to the regional level as well. So with that, I would like to introduce to you Julian Thompson.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and good afternoon to everyone who's joined us today for this conversation. I'm really thankful to the Innovia Foundation for welcoming me and the rest of the panelists to join you all today, and I'm looking forward to a robust conversation. As Meg said, my name is Julian Thompson, and I have the privilege of serving as the strategist for what we call the Institute for Capacity Building at UNCF, where we work on strategies for the transformation of HBCUs. My goal today, over the next 20 to 25 minutes, is to download as much as I possibly can about what we've learned over the last 18 months as we've dealt with a challenge of historic proportions and thought about how to navigate that challenge in the context of serving communities that oftentimes aren't served to the best of our ability. That conversation at UNCF has focused on the institutions that we serve, and those are HBCUs. We'll talk a little bit about those in a second. But I also want to make sure that we speak about the broader principles of how education and workforce groups can position themselves to be able to engage the communities that oftentimes are excluded from these conversations, and very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and perspectives as well. Some presenters are ones that like a nice clean presentation at the beginning and then questions at the end. I do not mind chats right in the middle. So if you have questions or thoughts or perspectives that you want to throw into the chat, I'll try to take a quick pick and then look at it and respond, but very much looking forward to the conversation today. As I said, I work for the United Negro College Fund, and for those of you who aren't familiar, it is a 77-year-old organization that works with 37 historically Black colleges and universities. Back in 1944, the basic idea was there were all of these minority-serving institutions, many of whom operated in the rural South, in Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee and South Carolina, that didn't have the ability to kind of have a national impact or to sort of tell their story nationally. So UNCF was founded to ensure that those institutions had a voice. They focused primarily on fundraising. And so over the course of the last 77 years, we've raised over $5 billion for the institutions that we care about and the students connected to them. But in recent decades, we've pivoted our attention to not only focus on fundraising, but also on scholarships and programs, and then critically for the purpose of today, capacity building. What does it mean to take an institution as it exists today and start to work on change management theories, new practices, new policies, new ways of engagement or networking that we think have power for their long-term sustainability? As we consider those questions at UNCF, we really think about the power of the network. And what we mean by that is, how can we break silos so that organizations with common mission and common purpose use common tools, common strategies, and common values to accomplish their goals? If you operate within higher education, you know that there are 4,000 institutions of higher education in the United States, many of whom duplicate systems and processes and tools in ways that oftentimes operate at their own detriment. So when we think about the solutions that make most sense for our institutions, we're oftentimes thinking about the power of that network. Like many of you who are thinking about sort of how to navigate this time, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has been an unprecedented crisis, right? And particularly when you think about it from the vantage point of HBCUs, that crisis has impacted African Americans in a way that oftentimes outpaces the challenges faced by other communities. So we know that there's a real moment here where we need to be laser focused on how we can engage and support communities who are being even further marginalized because of the challenges of this moment. African Americans in particular in this past 18 months have been more likely to have illness because of COVID-19, more likely to be laid off. So you're starting to think about workforce challenges. And then of course, the challenge of remote learning. Oftentimes people think about the African American community as being primarily one located in cities, but as of 3 years ago, the majority of African Americans in the United States live in the South. And so as we think about questions of how to make sure those communities are supported at UNCF, we're oftentimes thinking about the questions of living in rural Southern America and how our students need resources, tools, strategies in order to be successful. We know that the challenges facing our communities are not new. So we did a little bit of a study where we looked at the performance of African American populations in the 1960s and compared it to the performance of African American communities today. And we used measures in educational attainment and unemployment and incarceration and in wealth and other areas. And what we found a little bit dishearteningly is that when you compare African American to white performance in each of those categories, you see about the same gap as you saw from 60 years ago. What does that mean? It means we got to start to think about doing things differently. It means we need to lean into the people, the structures that are causing us to think about change and thinking about how we can align what we already know are scarce resources, scarce time, to be able to think about doing things differently. Because if we don't, we're likely to see the trends that you're seeing on this slide perpetuate. So it's a real clarion call for us. In early 2020, right before the pandemic, one of the ideas we started to explore was how our HBCUs, many of whom operate within rural spaces, could be a more critical part of regional ecosystem conversations about skill development. What do I mean by that? I mean that, as you all know, and as is the focus in Eastern Washington and Northern Idaho, there's a space, a locality that's thinking about skill development across the kindergarten to workforce pipeline. So it's got K-12 and higher education and workforce groups and employers and municipalities and governments. The question was, as we think about those HBCUs, but also about all those other actors, what are the steps we could take to make sure that they're acting in concert and that they're focused on the needs and priorities of those disadvantaged communities? The partnership was one that was threefold. So I mentioned a little bit the perspective that UNCF has as a consortium, as an entity that thinks about networks and also as a champion for minority students and communities. We engaged the Harvard Kennedy School, which helped us think about some of the policy dynamics involved in facilitating those connections. And then we were proud to partner with MZ, who provided us real insight on labor market analytics and how those labor market analytics could be applied to the critical questions of how a regional ecosystem of education and workforce groups work together. As I said, the theory of the pilot, and it was just a pilot in April of 2020, was to bring together government, workforce partners, higher education, K-12, and employers, and make sure that as you brought them all together, you focused on two key principles. One is data analytics, and the other is equity. And so that was the charge that was given to us as we engaged our regional stakeholders. In Atlanta, we made an intentional attempt to make sure that we had a comprehensive scope on who was engaged. So you can see here representation from the K-12 space. You can see the United Way here, who is a coordinator of many of the workforce efforts within the greater Atlanta region. You can see higher education institutions, not only technical and community colleges, but bachelor degree granting programs as well, because you oftentimes have to think about the interface between those two. And all of these groups were brought together by the city of Atlanta, who obviously has an interest in the well-being of their citizens. The idea behind the pilot was threefold. Number one, figure out ways for the network to be thinking about its strategy collectively. Meaning, each of those institutions I just showed you on the previous slide have their own interests, their own mission, their own history, all of which have to be respected. But how do we start to facilitate spaces that enable a networked approach to how we think about skill development? The second question was, when you build that network, we need to be using the same language and thinking about the same data. When you look under the cover of the institutions and organizations that we engaged, you oftentimes find that they're using different language to talk about the same thing. So when higher education offers a degree, that's oftentimes different than what's included on a job description, right? And so how do you think about using data dashboards and tools so that you can have a common way of considering the questions of reskilling and upskilling for your community? And then finally, and this is the point we'll get to a little bit later, is once you have that strategy intact, how do you actually make it real in conversation with the community that you care about? So that was the charge of the effort that we worked on. We used a skills-based focus, which basically says, rather than using industry-based departments or academic-based areas of inquiry or majors, we want to focus on skills. Skills that jobs are requiring, skills that are held by residents. And one of the great things about working with MZ is they had an analytics tool that enabled us to use skills to identify the demand in the region for skills, their supply, and not only their supply generally, but among specific populations that we wanted to target. And once you have the information on both sides, you can start to make the connections that help you build a strategy for the communities that you care about. We identified some target areas, and we set a theory that we wanted them to have a high likelihood of access, that they would be good paying jobs, and that the skill sets that folks would gain would be transformative. So you can see that instead of focusing only on industry areas, we started to think very carefully about competencies and skills as they existed on job descriptions, making sure that higher education and workforce could translate those competencies into their programs. When we did this work, and I can't emphasize this enough, it was critical that we focused our attention and our data analytics on the excluded populations that we cared about. In Atlanta, that was the African-American community, and in other spaces, it would be other racial or ethnic minorities. It could be people experiencing poverty. It could be individuals that are at the extreme end of a geographic space. But when you decide to create your market analytics tools, you have to focus on the community that you say you care about. And that ended up being really powerful for the tools that we ended up developing. As you can see on this slide, it's a little teeny part on the left-hand side. We created the analytics tool so that you could track Black employment by categories that had high, medium, and low ratios of Black individuals. That allows you to not just answer one question, but multiple questions. What are the areas where there are low Black employment, and what does that mean for figuring out how to transition them into higher paid work? What are the areas with high Black employment, and what can we learn about those industries as we think about how to make the entire sector or the entire economy work for that community? So having a specific emphasis on the target community ended up being really important. It started to lead us into a set of questions with our institutional stakeholders that started to pivot from strategy to the question of community enablement, right? Because you can build a great strategy, think about all the right data, pull the table together to bring in folks to network. But if you don't focus on the communities that you care about and think about the strategies from their vantage point, you're likely to not be successful. So one of the things that we started to do was to identify specifically which communities we said we cared about. These are the ones that we identified for UNCF. For your work, it might be a different community. It could include other categorizations, but it was important that we stated them up front at the beginning of our work as a principle for our organizing. We then said, if we care about these groups of excluded individuals, we have to bring in subject matter experts who know their experience with a level of dynamism and care. And so that enabled us to bring together this group that included an expert on trauma, an expert on race, Wendy Copeland from Goodwill, who's thinking a lot about adults who are persistently low income, an expert on incarcerated populations, an expert who's thinking about first-generation college students, right? We knew that if we wanted to develop a thoughtful theory, we couldn't start unless we had their voices at the table. Then we started to think about language, because if you're interested in change management, you have to start to use language that communicates a different set of values. One of the things that happens when you start to focus on engaging an excluded community is people will oftentimes perceive that community from a deficit-based mentality, right? You think about that community in terms of what it does not have, the resources it has not acquired, the accomplishments it does not have on its record compared to the standard group. You want to try to figure out how to change that mentality as you start to work with those communities so that you're authentically welcoming their voices and that you can cultivate them for the assets that they provide, knowing that they have been systematically excluded for a reason. After that, we decided to focus on two sort of principles of education and workforce program development that we wanted to center on when we thought about those groups. One is called developmental science, and this is basically saying that when you are engaged in the act of supporting learning, and supporting learning happens in all education and workforce groups, that is the foundation of what we're trying to do, that we have to acknowledge upfront that it involves physical considerations, social environment, and psychological traits and behavior. And so how do you explicitly articulate that those principles are a part of the learning journey and have to be engaged if you're looking for different outcomes? For us, that means that you have to start to center some things differently. When we talk to education and workforce groups, oftentimes they're talking about the hectagon or the hectagons on the outsides: technology, skills acquisitions, career pathways, pedagogy and pedagogical improvements. Those are all super important. But what are we talking about, or how are we centering the conversation on health, on safety of the people that we care about, on their long-term well-being, on making sure that we use strategies to minimize risk or to minimize harm to them, right? Understanding that those pieces are a part of the educational journey was really important for us to bring forward to our stakeholder group. The second sort of ideological premise that guided our engagement with excluded communities is called the science of learning. And the science of learning basically says there are a bunch of different sort of compartmentalized spaces that think about learning, whether it's neuroscience studying the brain, or cognitive science studying the human mind. You've got computer systems and thinking about how they operate. And then of course the traditional education department. But all of those interdisciplinary spaces contribute to how we ought to be thinking about learning. And so we wanted to make sure that as our institutions moved forward, that the science of learning took precedence. Oftentimes, as I said before, it means looking at some things differently. And for us, you see those three slices of this octagon that are in yellow. It oftentimes means as you're designing a program that you're maybe thinking more carefully about cognitive science, neuroscience, and psychology in the design and execution of what you're trying to accomplish. We developed this 6-part framework. It says, in essence, that if you're going to support an excluded community, that you have to work on a set of investments. Investments that create cultures of belongingness, meaning that the excluded community has a real sense that they belong to the space that you're creating. That you work on development of personal assets and agency, meaning that the excluded community feels a real sense that at the end of the road, there's something about this space that I could be a part of in terms of sharing power. That you're thinking about not only hard skills, but soft skills, because those are important considerations for helping a community get to a different space, even if it involves those technical hard skills that are oftentimes the focus. That you're thinking about organizational culture and the organizational culture that those communities are being welcomed into. The last two are about accountability and access. How do you start from the vantage point of the community that you care about, thinking about the accountability and transformational access points that they need to be successful? Particularly on the accountability side, there's an important question of developing accountability from the perspective of the community that you say you want to serve, and making sure that their voices are prioritized in your engagement. For us, it means that we have started on an important journey at UNCF, and I'll pause here before hopefully we can start up the conversation, where we're trying to figure out how to create the headspace and the momentum to do things differently. And that means that we've got to think about assessment differently. It means we have to think about our evaluation systems with more care. It means that we are starting to highlight best practices and common pitfalls for organizations that are taking on this work. And then ultimately, we all have to commit, HBCUs and all other institutions, to the technical assistance and capacity building that has to happen for communities that are excluded to be brought into the center. And so that's been the work of UNCF and a big part of the work of the Institute for Capacity Building over the last year and a half or so. It's been exciting to be a part of this journey. And one of the things that I reflect on a lot is we are in a moment of transformational change. And so it's exciting to be in a room full of leaders who had the opportunity to lean into this moment and figure out how to shape the change that you want to see for your communities or the people that you care about most. And it's been exciting to do so at UNCF as well on behalf of the communities that we care about. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and hopefully get to start a good conversation.
Julian, I have a quick question for you. So when you were talking about engaging your excluded populations and utilizing assets within those communities, how do you enter that community? Is it through trusted messengers, or can you describe that process a little bit for us?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Meg. And one of the things that is important to start with is thinking about the institutions of value for that community. So one of the things that we have to work on as a society is making sure that all communities in our society have strong nonprofit organizations strong educational organizations, strong churches, right? Strong networking groups, because if those types of institutions disintegrate, it becomes that much harder to build the bridge, right? So what we oftentimes think about in the question of figuring out how you facilitate that relationship, obviously starting with relationship building and individuals is important, but identifying the institutions that matter to that community and making sure that that bridge starts to get a little bit sort of more taught ends up being, I think, an important part of the conversation.
Additional questions for Julian? Feel free to unmute and.
Hi, Julian. Thank you. This is Tanya from Elk River Library in Elk River, Idaho. Can you hear me all right? I'm sorry.
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Yep.
We are very geographically isolated. Our population is 100 year round. So again, we here at the library have really been trying to take steps towards adult education and information and knowledge and, you know, assisting the people in the area. But our problem runs into whenever we try to do something outside of the area, we're so far away. Do you guys have any suggestions at all on how to, you know, go that one step further? And don't get me wrong, we really serve a great need here. We have a pretty good connection with our community members. But again, what happens is you only have to work with what you have, you know, in that local space. So I'm looking for any and all advice for outreach and programs. And again, it's very difficult. And with COVID, it made it even worse. And I'm sure everyone's experiencing the same thing. You know, people don't have the staff, you don't have the time, you can't come. But even in the greatest scenarios pre-COVID, we really have a problem bringing outside resources into our community. So that's my question, how to get started that way.
Yeah, I'm super interested in hearing from this group on that conversation because of your particular expertise in the locality in Eastern Washington and Northern and Idaho. I would say from our perspective, thinking about institutions in the rural South, number one is we're starting to focus a lot on how can the workforce analytics tools we use embrace the increasing amount of work opportunity that's remote. So when you think about our workforce systems, how sort of jobs feed into that system, the system of communicating with clarity and with accessibility, availability of certain jobs, oftentimes the systems are really only focused on what's being sourced by the specific region. Which may have had some salience in the pre-COVID era, but because of the explosion in remote work, we're trying to pay a lot of attention to the systems that we can accelerate that will get remote work opportunities to rural communities in the quickest possible way. So we're starting to hear a lot about that from some of our corporate partners. And I think that there has to be a much better infrastructure for trying to figure out how to get that information to communities in the quickest way possible. That same dynamic on remote work is also applying to remote education. And so the opportunity to reach not only the students who go to HBCUs, but to their moms and to their aunts and to their grandfathers because of the remote learning connection, we want to make sure to take advantage of. And so I would say that at least from the vantage point of UNCF, we know that being in a rural space gives you a tougher road. The question for us becomes, how do we lean into this moment and at least from the national vantage point, start to shape a future where the infrastructure for remote engagement and remote learning becomes much more dynamic for the communities we care about.
Awesome. Julian, thank you. I see a couple of questions in the chat that I think are actually really great ones to segue and introduce our panelists. You had that great sort of pie chart in your presentation about engaging stakeholders with data analysis and equity in mind. And I think our panelists cover that really well. So with that, I would like to introduce our three panelists for today, and then we'll open it up at the very end for additional questions and capture some of those that are in the chat as well. So I'd like to introduce to you Dustin Lester. Dustin is the Vice President of Consulting for Community Insights at MZ. He is stationed and lives in Ohio, in Cincinnati. And he is joining us today to talk a little bit about his work alongside Julian with the focus on equity and data. And then we also have Cassidy Peterson. Cassidy serves as Director of Education and Workforce Development at Greater Spokane Incorporated here in the region. She also facilitates the Spokane STEM Network, which is a regional network in partnership with the statewide network of Washington STEM, and is the network operator for Career Connect Washington. So she'll bring us a broad view of statewide work at a regional level. And then I'm also pleased to introduce Colby Matilla, who is the director of K-Tech, which is the Kootenai Technical Education Center over on our Idaho side of the border. And Colby brings great experience in engaging business and school districts in stakeholder networks to create more opportunity for students in the region. So I think to start, I'm going to kick off with one question for each of our panelists that kind of gets at their expertise, and then we'll open it up for questions after that. So Dustin, I'm going to get your question first. How can we have a better understanding of skills demand and gaps in a region that helps with the upskilling and reskilling of underemployed and underserved populations?
Thank you, Meg, and thanks to Julian. What a great presentation. And I think a lot of this, to help answer that question, it really relates to a lot of what Julian presented, which was a great presentation, by the way, Julian. What we did in coordination with Julian was we really looked at what were those skills, supply and demand gaps, and really understanding that as the first core of our research, to then understand, okay, how can we put that data into action? And so part of that analysis, one of the things that we uncovered, in the course of many things that we've uncovered, but unfortunately we saw that there were some existing, that there are existing equity gaps in the workforce in the two regions we analyzed. And giving an example, we saw that the Black community was underrepresented in some of the higher paying IT careers, and then overrepresented in some of the lower paying, transportation and logistics or warehousing roles. And so, though that information is of course sad and hard to hear, at the same time, what the stakeholders in those two regions, in coordination with Julian and UNCF and the other partners involved, is, okay, the conversations are now, how do we take that information and adjust to it and start to adjust programming and policy and resources and start to really work to address that problem. But now it's equipping these regions with specific data to really put individuals in those career areas on a career pathway. And our data, we went deep to understand, and it's a helpful tool that we have, and it's part of the analysis to say, okay, here is someone in this career area, here is a big demand over here. So we have oversupply and we have equity issues here. We have a big demand that is not being met by industry over here in these higher paying jobs. Let's put the resources and programming and policies in place to help clear the path and put individuals on an upward mobility to these really good career opportunities that industry is begging. We need people, and so that data has helped. And we're still in conversations with the stakeholders in those regions, and Julian definitely is. And we're not walking. We don't want to walk away from that, because it's important, because those things take time, and it's not a flip of the switch. It takes effort and focus and intensity over time. And that's a whole nother part of it. And I think that relates to a lot of what Julian talked about as far as the data is one thing, but you've got to put this framework in place to be successful long term.
Thank you. So as we have that vision that's a little broader, I'd like to ask Cassidy why is it important that we have a regional goal? So in the case of GSI, STEM Network, a regional education attainment goal, and why should employers be involved in that?
Yeah, thank you, Meg, and good afternoon, everyone. When I think about kind of the regional goal, well, first off, to define it for everyone that might not be as familiar, our community adopted a goal back in 2016 to reach 60% education attainment in Spokane County by year 2025. And similar to that goal, Washington State has a goal to reach 70% education attainment by year 2030. So when we think about that, that's all. Education attainment is really broad when we define post-secondary training, education, anything 1 year certificate, apprenticeship, and beyond. We know that that's really critical for our workforce here and our employers, because they need those trained, those educated employees and their talent pipeline to be ready and to be able to fill those gaps that they need. So when I think about the reason and the importance of looking at it as a community, it's kind of back to what Julian was saying, is defining it with common language. And a lot of times that takes translation, because we all speak our own languages. We all speak our own kind of industry type languages and lingos. So the type of work that we operate in with being a chamber, economic development council, as Meg said, we're also the STEM network, Career Connect Washington network for Eastern Washington. We find ourselves a lot as a mediator in the sense of like a translator. So hearing what our educators are doing and our systems are doing in that lens, and then being able to hear from our industry partners and our workforce development partners, okay, and then how can we find kind of this common ground and common language to push towards a collective goal, instead of different systems, for example, K-12 systems working towards higher graduation rates, or college system working towards higher acceptance rates or completion rates. How can we commonly define this bigger goal that will then serve our greater community? And of course, with a lens and view on those historically marginalized communities and populations that are, of course, all across Eastern Washington and Northern Idaho. So I kind of break that down, that question, in terms of thinking of the importance about the community goal, making sure it's a common language, and then reason why employers are needing to be involved is kind of going back to what I originally said, is they are the investors of their talent pipeline, or we hope that they are thinking about that down the road, thinking about the youngest learners, the kindergartners, and those kindergartners coming in ready to learn and ready to be prepared and ready to be trained, and then identifying those barriers and those steps along the way that those kindergartners will eventually hit before becoming employees of our regional employers. So it really takes a system work, of course. It takes a lot of intentional effort, as both Dustin and Julian said as well. But I think that's really the big importance from my view in our lens here.
That's great. I think Julian was answering a question in the chat. It really takes a village. That was one of his answers. So that really goes along with that. Colby, the community goal. You do that so well at K-Tech. Such impressive work that K-Tech does with the business community in partnership with surrounding schools. So what can be done in our schools to provide more career awareness and more focus on that community goal?
You know, thinking of the Northern Idaho and Spokane, I get to deal with the Silver Valley, so small rural schools, as well as the Coeur d'Alene area. First off, you need to be realistic about what industry you have. In my bio there, I grew up in Wallace, small town, heavy into natural resources. Those have since closed, and those companies have moved away, and now they are transitioning to a more tourist-based community, and you need to be really clear on what you're doing and where you're going. Partnerships are huge. you have to be realistic on what's there and who's working with you. You got to get those industry people in there. If it's restaurants, if it's ski hills, in the Coeur d'Alene area, we got a lot of new manufacturers coming into play. You need to be teaching the skills that they need, which means they need to be in there with you. Involving everyone is huge. Bringing those community members with you. We go out and we start talking to junior high students, elementary students. We go to the Boys and Girls Clubs, and we bring those industry partners along so the students can see that it's not just us as a school or us as a community saying it, it's coming from the people that are going to hire them. Also, you access those speakers in your area. There's large groups that want to come out and talk to your students. They want to be involved. So getting involved and bringing them out, and FaceTime with the students. FaceTime is huge. This generation, we've noticed if an employer comes out, spends time with them, they glob onto that employer and the students will go that direction. So by getting them in front of them, having those guest speakers come out, getting internships and externships, it's huge. It develops those work skills and really gets the students on track.
So I see a question in the chat that I think actually kind of goes along with that. It was given to us by Dirk, and maybe Julian, you addressed this in the chat, but for the group, Dirk would like to know, he says it's obvious to those of us in the training regarding the value of inclusion for excluded communities, but ultimately employers need to see the community assets. So what has been your approach to addressing ROI, return on investment, with employers? And I think actually any of you can answer that. So Julian, you want to start?
Yeah, and so that question of return on investment is, you know, as a person that's in a fundraising organization, so we try to go after grants and dollars where oftentimes people are putting in front of you, what's the change in graduation rate? What is the difference this is going to make in terms of, you know, how many more people fill this job, right? Like, so understand that ROI is a really important consideration, but ROI is also a part of a broader ideological challenge and question of how and in what ways we see and determine value, right? Oftentimes, for instance, if you look at the performance of HBCUs and you just isolate first generation low income students, HBCUs way outperform their other counterparts, but it takes education to help people understand the assets. You know what I mean? And so this is probably just a deeply dissatisfying answer. So Meg, I'm now regretting going first, but I just think I'm committed to the long-term work of making sure that people understand community assets as they exist, right? Like the time for forcing minority communities to twist themselves into a knot trying to demonstrate value has to be challenged while keeping accountability and transparency at the forefront. So that's the headspace I'm in. And like I said, I'm so sorry that I went first.
That's okay. Anybody? How about opening that up to the other panelists? Dustin, Cassidy, Colby?
I might jump in just to elaborate a little bit, Julian, and I know it sounds a lot simpler than it really is, but challenge us all to really turn it back on the employers and ask, how would you define ROI? And just asking them to kind of lay that out. And then back to Julian saying the importance of defining community assets and understanding how they are right now, then taking that definition or taking that list of what they would see ROI as and trying to make those connect the dots with those community assets and find, of course, there'll be gaps, most likely. If not, then being able to explain back to that employer or the association or the industry group, say, okay, well, we already have these in our community. How do we need to better amplify or strengthen or elevate those to serve your greater need? So again, it sounds a lot simpler than it is, but that's what I would add.
Anyone else on that question? Awesome. So audience, I want to remind you, you're welcome to take your microphone off mute and ask a question. Or you can place it in the chat and I'll forward it through, but if you'd like to open up and ask, please do. So we do have a question in the chat about, and I have another one I'm going to ask as well, but Julian Patrick is very curious about asset versus deficit language when talking about communities. How has that change in language affected your strategic priorities?
Yeah, so one of the things I think about, so, on this ROI question, because y'all really got my gears grinded thinking about that. Anyway, on this ROI question, oftentimes with HBCUs, you're operating with rural kids who are first generation and low income, so they don't have the performance of their PWI counterparts. We started to do work to identify and clarify community assets that the institutions themselves bring. Because if you're an institution working in that community, you have an outsized impact on the employment within that community. You have an outsized impact on mentorship and other civic engagements within that community. It ends, once again, reiterating this question of how do you change the narrative in sort of engaging institutions to think about the assets that they bring. So that's been really important for us to conceptualize. It's caused us to think about how we position institutions differently, from solely educational institutions to what we now call cornerstone assets of the communities that they come from. And when you position an organization that way, the possibilities of what they can do is communicated so much more clearly. So that's just one example of how we try to sort of shape the narrative, and therefore, we work on behalf of institutions to make sure that people understand their value and that they can work on the resources that they need. And that strategy has been really critical.
Awesome. Amy had a question earlier about contextualizing the strategies and learning that you have for tribal communities. And Dustin, if you have some thought on that as well.
Yeah, it's so critical to understand those needs and be responsive to them, and really, it's a combination of making a data-informed approach, but also understanding what their needs are by listening and asking the right questions and really engaging those communities directly. Just like with all things, data's crucially important, and it really sets the foundation of a conversation, but it needs to have that second part. It really needs to connect to getting into a community and engaging with local leaders, individuals, the workforce, and businesses, and really just asking the right questions to make sure that the problem is being addressed very specifically to their community and not a one-size-fits-all solution. So that's my recommendation.
That's awesome.
Yeah, just to quickly add on that, I know that for the tribal community, and when we talk to our colleagues in the American Indian College Fund or in other sort of groups that are bringing together tribal colleges, their relationship to regional workforce and education efforts is going to be very unique and by its nature unique because of the dynamics of their community. It is so hard, and somebody else answered the question of how do you get everyone? The question ultimately becomes, how do you cultivate a space where you can suspend your own mission and values to be able to properly understand, engage, and respond to the values and priorities of someone else, right? And to me, that aspect of listening that Dustin just talked about, it's just the nature of leadership. So one of the interesting things to play out, at least in UNCF's work, is who's right for that leadership, right? If you can acknowledge that your organization, because of its past, because of challenges it's had with that community, is not best positioned to be that leader, then who are you partnering with, right? Do you have the humility to say, we're not right the right one to communicate this perspective, or there's someone else who ought to be at center stage, and then suspending your own mission and values of your organization for the need of that community. I think that's what it's going to take. The question is who's positioned to take that type of leadership and move it to the next level. It's something that we think about a lot.
So there was a specific question for, well, actually two that I really like. One was for Colby to talk a little bit about the partnership with Habitat, but at the same time, I'm going to ask if you and Cassidy both could talk a little bit about any efforts that are at play to create some sort of regional dashboard so that we can all be on the same page. So let's go to the Habitat question first, and then we'll end with maybe a more aligned focus for the region.
Well, thanks for teeing that up, James. It is always one of my happier moments to talk about our partnership with Habitat. I was fortunate enough to start that program many years ago when I was the construction teacher here at K-Tech. We have a really strong partnership with Habitat for Humanity in North Idaho. It kind of goes back to that ROI. We're providing not only a skilled workforce for the construction companies in our area, but with the huge support of Habitat, we're able to help provide housing for needy families in North Idaho and throughout the region. And to me, that's huge. It's us giving back as well as the community supporting what we do. Habitat's just fantastic and can't speak highly enough. As far as the dashboard piece, there's companies that are putting together a lot of information. I can email out some of those links. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but that information is out there. Cassidy, you want to take it?
Yeah, kind of from our lens, a couple of things come to mind for the dashboard. So as Meg mentioned, we're a partner with statewide organization Washington STEM. And so again, I know this is more Eastern Washington focused, but of course, I mean, it can be adapted somewhat, I think, in Northern Idaho as well. Washington STEM puts out annual reports for every region across Washington. So there's 9 regional reports called STEM by the Numbers every year. And I can drop the link in the chat in just a moment. Ours was just released. And this is really just shedding light on how we're moving the needle across areas such as early math, dual credit, credential enrollment, and credential attainment, and how that plays into everything we've been talking about here today. Right now, it's just a PDF online. They are working to put that into a more tangible kind of full-on dashboard, hopefully in the next year. So we use that as kind of a guiding post for a lot of our decisions and driving investments and partnerships and whatnot across our region, as well as I would say the Lumina Foundation is a national foundation, and they put out a Stronger Nation report every year. And that's really focused on the percent of education attainment essentially across all states. And then it dives down into each county as well. And so I can drop both those links in the chat, but those are 2 dashboards that really we rely on our work, and I think would be beneficial to folks here.
Great, well, thank you. And we are just about out of time. It goes so fast. Thank you all for joining us. And for Colby, Cassidy, Dustin, and Julian for providing all this great information for our audience today. I'm going to kick this back to Aaron, who is going to provide some closing remarks and next steps. I did see that Sarah put all of your emails in the chat, and any questions that you put in the chat that weren't addressed in this particular time frame, we'll send along to our panelists to see if we can get some answers for you. So
Great.
Aaron, are you there?
Thank you, Meg. Really appreciate that. And again, thanks so much, Julian, Colby, Dustin, Cassidy. We value our partnerships with each of you, the incredible work that you're doing both here in our region and across the country on this important topic. We're grateful for your expertise and the time that you've given us today. As we close out, I want to just give a warm thank you again to our sponsors for the Leadership Summit, which includes the event that took place on March the 25th, as well as our series of workshops. So a very warm thank you to Numerica Credit Union, Baker Construction, the University of Washington, and Kimley and Haygood. And before we close out, I want to just remind everyone that the next event in our series is coming up on Wednesday, June the 9th, and we are going to be spotlighting the important issue of broadband across our region and how vital broadband is to so many of the things that we do to ensure equity and that communities are vibrant and sustainable for everyone who lives there. So you watch for more information on that upcoming workshop. And we hope to see all of you again coming up on Wednesday, June the 9th. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and make it a great day. Well, great work, everyone. That was excellent. Thank you. Hey, Julian, we were watching some of your slides, and Shelly and I are actually here in the same room. We were thinking some of that data is so aligned with our Say Yes to Education work and closing the opportunity gap in education. So thank you. I mean, this conversation really teed up some important work in a lot of ways that we are focusing on as a foundation. So that was great.
Very, very exciting. Very, very exciting.
Julian, I appreciated, Julian, the way